Welcome to the third part of this tutorial about Davinci Resolve 15. Today we're looking at the Deliver page. In the previous episode, we looked at the Edit page. There are some pages in between Edit and Deliver here. That's because Fusion, Color, and Fairlight, they're arguably optional steps. So Fusion, you might do some effects work. Color, obviously color work. Fairlight, you do some complicated audio editing. But Deliver, that is all about taking our edited project and actually exporting it to a format that you can upload to YouTube or wherever. So this is the Deliver page. What you have in the interface is your render settings up here in the top left. You have a viewer in the middle. You have the render queue on the right hand side. You have this kind of film strip view in the middle here as well. This represents every clip that's on your timeline, but that's also regardless of how long they are as well. And finally, you have basically a duplicate of your edit timeline below as well. So basically exporting your project to a video file, or even a number of video files, has a number of steps. If you look at these render settings here, you decide what settings you want. You then decide how long or how much of your project you want to render out. And then finally, you add that to the render queue. And then when you're ready to go, you hit Start Render, the computer goes off and works through those jobs for you. The first thing you're going to notice for the render settings is that it's kind of cramped. One of the interface elements that Davinci Resolve uses is this little down arrow here. This down arrow, wherever you see it, and you'll see it on places like the Edit page as well, if you press that, it basically forces that panel at the top down to the bottom of the screen. So it becomes essentially double height. The timeline gets pushed in. But that's perfect for what we want to do now. So there are some presets here. They're perhaps not all immediately understandable if you're coming to this brand new. Things like YouTube and Vimeo, clearly if you click on them, you can see that some of the settings change. They're okay settings. I would say that perhaps they're not optimal. There's things like H.264 Master. There's even other things like Final Cut Pro, Premiere, and Avid as well. That means that if you're working with some other people and they're using different editing software, you can basically do what's known as a round trip. So you can export all the files from your project so they can take them in, then they can work on them and pass them back to you as well. And also there are choices for if you're doing the same thing for people who are audio processing and stuff like that. Chances are if you're using this for YouTube, you're going to be looking at these first kind of settings. Although normally I don't just use this YouTube setting. So the first stage of this is really deciding where is this footage good to go. Have you edited this to put it on YouTube? Have you edited this to put it on Vimeo? Have you edited this so it's going to be shown on a projector on the side of a building? All those different use cases are going to have different settings that are optimal for that particular file that you're exporting. So, for the case of YouTube, it's best if we have a look at what YouTube actually says. And if you Google for this page, it's just called Recommending Upload Encoding Settings. It's just on YouTube Help. You can see that there are a bunch of settings here that YouTube recommends for best case. It says container MP4, we can actually talk about that in a second. Audio codec, AAC, video codec. Here's one you're going to see a lot, H.264. That is a common codec for encoding the video. Frame rate, because ours is a 60 frames a second project, ours is going to be 60 frames. But bitrate, here is the big one. Bitrate is normally the thing that controls the quality, the visual quality of your actual finalized video. And what we can see here is there's a table here for HDR for high dynamic range, but we are normal standard dynamic range videos. This is the table we want to look at. So we are 1080p, we are not a standard frame rate, we are 60 frames a second. So YouTube suggests that should be 12 megabits per second. So if we go back over to Davinci Resolve now, click on Custom, you can see that similar settings are here. Now, YouTube said that they wanted MP4 as the file format. File formats aren't as important as the actual codec. In many cases, the codecs are available independent of that file format. So for QuickTime, although codec.h.264 is there are other codecs that you could use within that QuickTime file. So although YouTube said, hey, we prefer MP4, in actual fact, giving them a QuickTime encoded with H.264 as well, because that's the codec they preferred, is entirely fine. Another thing I do is I turn on network optimization. That generally allows YouTube to process the file faster. Resolution is the same as our project settings. The frame rate is 60, that's set. Here we go again looking at quality. You want to restrict it to a certain data rate. In this case, so if we go back to YouTube, that said we had 12 megabits per second. But Resolve has this in kilobits per second. The maths to do that is pretty easy, but if you're unsure at any time, here's another really good website. This website is called Wolfram Alpha. Think of it like Google, but you can ask it mathematical or even time-based or even physics-based questions. I just put in 12 megabits per second in kilobits per second, and it'll export and tell me what the result is there as well. So if you're ever converting one to another and you're not sure on the maths, then this is a great website for that. It's called Wolfram Alpha. I'll drop a link to this in the description as well. Now, thanks to the YouTube help file, we know that we have 12 megabits a second to play with in terms of data rate. Encoding profile is like a setting that tells the encoder how many of the tools that H.264 uses it can apply when encoding. So if you're going to run the video on a very old computer or a very old device, maybe you want to set this to base or main or something like that. However though, for YouTube, just leave it on auto, it's absolutely fine. Things like keyframes and frame reordering as well, that's what applies to H.264 as well, just leave them set like that, that's default. In advanced settings, again we have a choice to change the pixel aspect ratio, leave it square. The data levels as well, just leave it on auto. If you do have high dynamic range, then this is a place where you could decide not to export them like that. Data binding is useful if you've got extra information actually sat on the clip and you want to either remove it or whatever. Use optimized media is if you ask Resolve to generate some optimized media because the media you were using wasn't very good for editing with, you can then tell Resolve, hey, by the way, use the optimized media. It'll generally speed up the rendering performance, but at the expense of quality, identical to use render cached images. Enable flat pass is if you did a whole bunch in the color page and you want to say, you know what, all those color page changes, do not apply them, then you would enable render flat pass. But for us, we'll just leave that off. These ones here, disable edit and input sizing. I'd leave that off as well. You've probably made those choices earlier on when you were working on your project. You can force the sizing to the highest quality as well. That's if you've set the quality to bilinear because it processes better, then you can force it to the highest quality here. Also, finally, we have force debear to highest quality. If you're dealing with raw data, that is raw camera data, debear is basically taking that camera data and turning it into data that you can actually view, but that is often done at a lower quality to get more editing performance, and you can force that on here. If you're working with game footage like I am, it doesn't apply, just leave it off. Finally, here we have subtitle settings. If you do have some subtitles set up, and I haven't in this video, it's perhaps something I'll cover in another video. You can tell it to export into a separate file here. YouTube does allow you to export SRT files here if you had subtitles set up in Resolve. Going over to audio, although YouTube told us to upload an AAC, I've always just uploaded linear PCM. It doesn't add a huge amount to the file size, to be honest, and I feel like the quality's better. It never really gets crushed by YouTube's processing. And finally, we have the file page. Here's where you set up the actual file name and all that kind of stuff that's getting generated. So if I just type in a file name here, you notice that it gets updated at the top there as well. If you want to add a suffix onto the end of the file, you can add that, or you can tell it to save into a subfolder. If you're exporting multiple clips, like instead of at the top here, instead of setting to a single clip, like we're doing for YouTube, you can export each individual part of your timeline as an individual clip. You can then tell it to add digits to the end of those clips as well, if they're going to overlap each other. Finally, here we have render speed as well. Basically, how much of your computer's resources you want to apply to rendering out this video. And it's just a percentage here that you can pick. I find that Resolve processes and renders out videos pretty fast, but if you were to be doing some other work at the same time, maybe you're editing a Word document, maybe you're writing emails, something like that, depending on your system performance, you may find that that becomes sluggish. If so, you can come in here and change the render speed of this particular item in the queue to be lower. But all I'm going to do now is, I'm happy with that, that's all set up, the file name's there, all the settings are right, the location is where I want it to be. I'd now just hit add to render queue. And that job appears in the render queue to be done the next time you hit start render. You can actually give the jobs a name if you want as well. So there we go, we know that that job is the 1080p YouTube output. However, and I'm going to show you a little tip for exporting for YouTube that some people have been doing for a while now. If we go back to that YouTube help page, you'll notice that 1080p, 60 frames a second, is 12 megabits per second. However, if we were working at 1440p or 2K, you would get 24 megabits per second. That's a significant increase in data rate, and obviously increase in resolution as well. You may have noticed that sometimes when you upload things to YouTube, their quality isn't the greatest. There is some processing that YouTube does as well. So what some people have been doing for quite a while now is even though your video is all edited at 1080p, at the final stage, when you're getting ready to produce a video to actually give to YouTube, you upscale from 1080p to 1440p, give yourself some more resolution, but also give yourself a much higher data rate. And anecdotally, some people think that if you give YouTube that higher quality file, that when YouTube automatically produces the lower quality file, that lower quality file looks a bit better as well. Although, like I say, that's kind of more anecdotal. So if you did want to do that, how would you do that in Resolve? We can edit these settings again now because we know that previous job has already been added to our job queue. So let's change this up here. Let's change the file name to 1440 YouTube. The resolution, this time we're not going to go with the resolution of our timeline, we're going to change that. And I know, just from memory really, that 1440 is 2560 by 1440. So we're telling Resolve now, this content that we're coming out of our timeline, although it's 1080p, I want you to scale that up to 2560 by 1440. And also we know that because it's now going to be a 1440p file, I can change the quality here, the data rate, to double what it previously was. But everything else should be the same. And I'm just going to add that to the render queue as well. And just to keep things organized, I'll just change this job name too. So far I've given you 2 different exports to do from Resolve. However, what I found is that Resolve's H.264 encoding is okay, but it's not the best one that I've found. There are some other free tools around that can give you, I would say, better quality at the same or similar settings. If you look at a program like Handbrake, it'll allow you to do multipass encoding, which obviously takes more time, but I would say gives you a better end result. So when I export to go to a different program, what kind of settings do I use? That's a good question. So what I want now is the best possible quality output I can get from Resolve. I don't particularly care about file size at this point. I'm just saving to a bunch of hard drives. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stay with QuickTime. There's nothing wrong with that as the base file format. But the codec, I don't want H.264. H.264 is great as a final delivery codec. It's good for viewing on phones, even broadcast, anything like that. But what it is, it's actually quite destructive to the actual individual frames of the video. It's fine for viewing it back, but for editing and for absolute maximum clarity, it's not a very good choice. So I click on that codec. You'll remember that the cache settings we set before were on DNx HD, and this is what I generally use if I'm going to export and then encode with a different piece of software. So I can then pick the particular flavor of DNx HD. I tend to just use the highest 8-bit one, which is just one up from the default. I can turn off network optimization because this file is never going to leave my computer. This is just something I want to use as a kind of intermediary step, and everything else I'll keep the same. Although I must remember to just change the file name, and now add the render queue as well. So there we have 3 separate jobs ready to render out. We have 1080p with YouTube settings, we have 1440p with YouTube settings, and we have our kind of best possible quality coming out, which is our DNx HD. When you hit start render, it'll do exactly that. It'll start processing these videos. Depending on your system, so that's your processor, how much RAM you've got, how good your GPU is, and also how good your storage is, but also depending on how long your project is as well. It might take a couple of minutes, may even take a couple of hours, depending on what you decided and how big your project is, like I said. So let's just hit start render, and I'll obviously edit this so that you're not sitting and watching this. So there we are, all 3 jobs in the render queue have finished, and you can see how long each one took to process as well. And this kind of split in terms of timing is about where I'd imagine it. This is a project that's only 26 seconds long. It took about 40 seconds for the YouTube 1080p one to export. That's probably a little bit slower than I'd normally expect, mainly because I'm obviously recording this tutorial video at the same time, and that's probably taking up some resources. But if you look at that as a kind of rough percentage difference, that's about what I would expect. It's going to take a little bit longer for it to upscale for this middle job here. It's also upscaling each frame and then encoding it at a higher bitrate, so it's going to take a bit more time. The fastest job there is the DNx HD one. Basically, it's not having to do any kind of compression at all. It just takes the frames and throws them into a file as fast as it can possibly manage. And I think I'm probably limited by storage speed at that point, I would guess. So that one only took 22 seconds. So now let's have a quick look at the actual files themselves. So here are the 3 files set on my hard drive: the YouTube, the 1080p, 1440p, and the basically uncompressed DNX HD. You'll notice that because the data rate kind of doubled between those 2 files, they are roughly double in file size as well. But what you'll also notice is that the DNX HD, the basically uncompressed file, is dramatically larger than the others. It means that if I've edited, say, a 10-minute video, if I export to DNX HD to then re-encode in another software, that file size could be 30 or 40 gigabytes. Like, it's enormous. I don't keep those files around, they're just a sort of intermediary step where I'm looking to get the best possible quality out of Resolve and then allow that second package to then encode them. Looking at those other packages, that's perhaps another video for another day. This has easily gone on for long enough, I'm sure you'll agree. So if you were now saying, hey, I've finished my video, I've exported it, either of those 2 top files would be fine to upload to YouTube. Quality is going to be reasonable. The 1440p one with a higher data rate is going to be better. But we've successfully now imported footage into Resolve 15. We've edited it together, and now, looking at our intended destination, set up render settings, and exported media ready to upload. You may also now be thinking, wow, there's a lot of settings to actually go through and set each time I want to export a project. And a bit like doing the initial project setup, I'd actually agree. That's why, as you see, there's a whole bunch of presets here. If this is a job that I do all the time, which it actually is, I can come up to this little menu here and say save as a preset. Type in a preset name and hit OK. And Resolve will let you generate presets. So if I wanted one for exporting to another package, that's this one. If I wanted one for direct export to YouTube, I can create another one as well. So when you come into the actual deliver page, you can click on the settings you want, give them a rough eyeball. Is that exactly what I need? Yes, it is. Am I rendering out the entire timeline? Yes, I am. Does it all look right in these clips? Yes, it does. Make sure your file names are all right. Make sure it's saving in the right place. Add to render queue. Bang. Hit start render, and you can export. You don't have to be spending a huge amount of time here. But it is important that you kind of understand what a lot of these settings are, because some of them do directly relate to what kind of quality you're going to get out. So thank you for watching this third part of our look at Davinci Resolve 15. The next tutorial I think will be on Fusion, kicking things up a bit. It's going to be a slightly different one if you're not used to node-based workflows, but come back for part 4 and I'm sure we'll make something that looks cool and that you'll want to try out yourself. If you did enjoy this video, please do tap the sub button, hit the thumb button, even people just saying, hey, I enjoyed watching. I really do appreciate that. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in part 4. Take care.